Hello, greetings. Welcome to another series of weekly devotionals where we take a look at one of the lectionary readings for this upcoming week and offer some thoughts for reflection and meditation. This week we're looking at some verses in Psalm 50, the first 6 verses of Psalm 50, and most scholars will suggest that these particular verses in Psalm 50 are an introduction, a precursor to a speech that is going to be given by God to God's people. In verse 3, we read, "Our God comes and does not keep silence." And so one of the things that folks will say nowadays when introducing certain speakers is they will say, "I would like to introduce to some and present to others." And what that means is that this speaker is familiar to some people in the audience, but maybe new and unfamiliar to others in the audience. And I think that's something to reflect upon as we consider God's speech, God's voice, God's message to God's people. Is it something indeed that is familiar to us? Is God's voice something we strive to listen to hear on a daily basis? Is God's message something that guides our daily living, our choices, our decisions that we make? Does God's teaching direct us, guide us? Or is God's voice sort of unfamiliar to our living? Do we live by the ways of the world instead of the voice of God? Do we have different priorities than God's priorities? Is God's message something we try and avoid? Well, in the very next verse 4, we learn what God's speech is going to be about. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. God is going to render judgment to God's people. Now, in the United Church of Christ, I think we tend to like to focus on the warm and fuzzy, loving God, and we don't like to hear too much about judgment. But indeed, God's judgment, God's justice is part of God's love. And one of the things we UCCers are familiar with is the phrase, "God is still speaking." And that's a popular motto from a few years ago. Indeed, as God spoke to God's people many years ago, God is still speaking to us. And our thought for today is to ask ourselves the question, are we listening? Amen.